In 1934, the head of the new Armée de l'Air, Pierre Cot, had a major problem. Every aircraft in his service's inventory was obsolete or soon would be. He therefore needed planes to help the army by observing what the enemy was doing. He needed planes to stop the enemy doing likewise in the day or at night, and he needed aircraft to strike the enemy's troops and supplies when they were beyond the range of friendly artillery. Unfortunately for Pierre Cot, construction and equipping of the Maginot Line had drained the already quite strained French government finances. 15 years of slim pickings had also impacted the French aviation industry's ability to create a mass-producible aircraft of any type. For years, the Air Ministry had commissioned prototypes but no series production. Cot's solution was a strategic fighter that could, with minor changes to a basic pattern, be adapted to accomplish multiple roles. He was not the first to come up with this idea, but he was the first to see it realised. Cot's second misfortune was that the febrile politics of France in this period caused the eventual Potez 63 to be produced too late and in too small numbers to affect the outcome when the Phony War turned into all-out war in May 1940. And of course, like others in Germany, he had overestimated the value of heavy fighters in combat with lighter ones and the ability of French engineers to actually match the technology of other nations. When you go searching for technical information about the Potez 63, you often get the same thin material rehashed with the odd word here and there. Accepting basic laziness, and I'm no different than anyone else there, I think the reasons for this paucity of information are twofold. First, the 63 series was not just a strategic fighter, but also the epitome of France's strategic failure to act soon enough, decisively enough, or with sufficient conceptual accuracy to respond to the Luftwaffe's rapid growth in the second half of the 1930s. It is more interesting as a strategic case study than as an aircraft. Second is that because of what it symbolises, the 63 is a bit of an embarrassment to French aviation, and thus one that's not all that fun to research. So with those constraints in mind, let's get started on the 63. Based on Cot's vision, on October 31st, 1934, the Air Ministry issued a specification that called for a kind of Swiss Army knife aircraft. It was to be twin-engined with 2 or 3 crewmen and able to undertake 3 main missions. First, it was to be able to act as a 3-seat fighter leader, housing the commander of a large formation of single-engined, single-seat fighters who would direct the actions of the fighters by radio. Second, as a 2-seater, it would be able to act as a day bomber. Associated with this, it would be a heavy fighter escort for Army cooperation aircraft. Thirdly, also as a 2-seater, it could be a night fighter. The specification called for a top speed of at least 450 km per hour at 4,000 metres, 280 miles an hour at 13,000 feet in old money. The climb to 4,000 metres was to take less than 15 minutes. Endurance was to be at least 4 hours at 200 miles an hour. Armament was 2 20mm Hispano-Suiza cannons facing forward and a flexible mount for a defensive rear-firing machine gun. Ambitiously, the idea was to create a 2-seat, 2-place fighter that could manoeuvre with a single-seat, single-engine fighter. That meant limiting weight to 3 tons or 6,600 pounds, although this was later raised to 7,000 pounds. The weight and speed requirements meant that engine choice was critical. Fortunately, 2 new narrow-diameter, 600-horsepower, 14-cylinder twin-row radials from Gnome Rhone and Hispano-Suiza were nearing operational readiness. Given that both engines were new and innovative, the Air Ministry specification called for the aircraft to be demonstrated with both motors. Potez therefore designed their Model 630 around the Hispano and the 631 around the Gnome Rhone. The type is therefore commonly referred to as Potez 63, but that covers many variants that were built in the run-up to war. All 63s were cantilever all-metal monoplanes with low wings and a twin-fin tail and retractable undercarriage. It was carefully streamlined by the designers, Corollaire and Delaroule, who had it made with a stressed skin and flush rivets. A long canopy housed the pilot, an optional observer and mission commander for some missions, and a radio operator cum rear gunner who manned a single 7.5mm Mach 34 light machine gun. Because the Air Ministry's needs were pressing and their budget vanishingly small, The Potez 630 and its rivals were designed in a compressed period at their manufacturer's expense. Manufacture of the first prototype began in April 1935 and it was completed in early 1936, with the first flight taking place on April the 25th. The BF-110, which is sometimes claimed to have been inspired by the Potez 63 series, in fact flew just a couple of weeks later on the 12th of May 1936. At this stage, the 630 had a braced wooden stabilizer with no dihedral, suitable for the testing of fins and rudders of various shapes and sizes, but it was otherwise similar to the eventual production aircraft. That made it 36 feet and 4 inches long with a wingspan of 52 feet and 6 inches. A disaster was narrowly avoided when the port engine shed a propeller blade on May the 3rd, 1936. The engine promptly also departed the aircraft, hanging off by 2 remaining connectors. Remarkably, the pilot, Andrei Nicole, managed to jettison the engine and landed without further damage. By August, the prototype was rebuilt with what would become the final tail assembly. That featured a substantial dihedral. There was also longer stroke shock absorbers in the landing gear. The prototype flew regularly until January 1937, until it was grounded again for small modifications to the flying surfaces to improve longitudinal stability and some tweaks to the 580 horsepower 14 HBS engines. This raised power to 640 horsepower at sea level, 700 horsepower at sea level for takeoff with 640 millimeters of mercury of boost pressure, and 725 horsepower at altitude. For the time, the 630 had quite good performance. Maximum speed was 286 miles an hour at 16,500 feet. It climbed to 13,000 feet in just under 6 minutes with a peak climb rate of just over 2,000 feet per minute. Cruising range and 800 litres of internal fuel was 800 miles, and its maximum takeoff weight had gone up to 8,488 pounds. Seismic changes were occurring in the French aviation industry at this time in late 1936. Having been out of government for a time, Cot was back. He was dismayed by the lack of urgency and effectiveness of the private French manufacturers and decided that the emergency rearming required special measures. He therefore nationalised all of the main private companies in the industry, amalgamating them together into regional concerns. SNCAN, and please forgive my pronunciation mistakes, Société Nationale de Construction Aéronautique du Nord, was formed on December 23, 1936. On the 1st of January, 3 of Potez's factories were incorporated into this venture. By April, his entire enterprise was a part of SNCAN, which employed a total of 5,500 people. SNCAN were immediately instructed to build 10 prototypes, 4 630s and 3 631s, 2 633B2 light bombers with a small bomb bay between the pilot and rear gunner, and 1 637A3 reconnaissance aircraft. The A3 had a glazed gondola in place of the bomb bay, in which an observer could lie down to take pictures and generally well observe. The order was later amended to replace one of the 633s with a 639 AB2 low-level close support aircraft. Cot was thus realising his strategic fighter vision. He also issued a new specification intended to produce a more advanced twin-engined aircraft ready for service in 1938. Production of what was intended to be the interim Potez 63 series began in May 1937, with manufacturing shared out across the SNCAN plants. The first prototype of the 631, fitted with Gnome-Rhone Mars radials, flew for the first time on March 15, 1937, with test pilot Georges Detré at the controls. The 14 Mars was between 10 and 15% less powerful than the Hispano, producing 570 horsepower at sea level, 700 for takeoff with 1100 millimeters of mercury of boost, and 660 horsepower at altitude. It was, however, more streamlined, and it would prove more reliable. Top speed of the 631 was about 6 miles an hour lower than the 630. Externally, the 630 and the 631 can be distinguished by the engine cowlings. The Gnome-Rhone powered 631 has a smaller cross-section and an oil cooler radiator duct mounted below the nacelle. The slightly larger Hispano-Suiza engine has its oil radiator above the cowling. The 631 prototype also suffered an early accident when the landing gear was not locked down in the proper position and the aircraft thus belly landed and had to be repaired. After that repair, the 631 went for official trials in November 1937. Months before, in July 1937, a production order had been placed for 10 two-seat pilot instruction and 30 three-seat triplester chasse or C-3 day fighters. The idea was to get the first of those aircraft into production within 8 months, which put deliveries in February 1938. For reference, the first pre-production Bf-110 had been delivered in early January 1937, despite the prototype taking its maiden flight 18 days after the Potez 630. Since the Gnome-Rhone engines were not yet in mass production, another 80 aircraft were ordered with the Hispano engines. 50 B-2 light bombers were added to the order in December 1937, bringing the total order to 180 machines. The first production examples of any type flew in February 1938, and the first service machine was delivered on the 23rd of May 1938, with 3 others delivered by the end of the month. They were nearly 4 months behind the intended schedule, although even with the added weight of service equipment, their performance was nearly identical to that of the 630 prototype. Unfortunately, all of the 630s suffered with engine problems, and it was quickly decided to withdraw them from frontline use and instead modify them as dual-control trainers. In March 1938, the rearmament plan, known as Plan 5, was approved by the French government. The advanced 1937 specification had yet to result in a production-ready aircraft, so orders were placed for 207 Potez 631s in 2- and 3-seat configurations and 449 Potez 633s in 2-seat light bomber configuration. Another 125 633s were added to the order by the end of March, but the ministry also asked that they be 3 rather than 2-seaters. Dithering was a feature of the rearmament program, and a good deal of time that could have been spent making aircraft was spent tinkering with their designs. And then, just to illustrate that point, the 633 order was cancelled and transferred to 631 production. 60 of the 637 Recon aircraft were added in August to replace obsolete Potez 542s. It was around this time that the Potez 63.11 was being formulated as an Army cooperation machine. The 6311 came about in 1937 because of the French Air Staff's difficulty in defining the requirements for their T3, triplester travail machines, intended to replace obsolete types like the Breguet 27, Potez 31, and Le Moreau 115 and 117. Those bureaucratic issues led to them asking SNCAN to propose a dedicated observation version of the Potez 63, designated, as I said, 6311. It was designed at the Malt factory, and it was quite different to the basic 63 line. The forward and mid fuselage were totally redesigned, retaining only the wing, tail, and landing gear. The nose was glazed for observation, improving the view relative to the 637 and reducing drag in comparison to the rather archaic gondola position of that aircraft. In the prototype, the glazed nose was rounded, but in order to provide a distortion-free view, that was changed to flat plexiglass panels thereafter. Fitting the large glazed nose led to the glasshouse being truncated so that the canopy is more centrally mounted. Because of supply issues, there wasn't a standard propulsion setup for any aircraft. They were thus equipped either with Gnome-Rhone 14M45 engines, turning 3-bladed variable pitch Ratier propellers, or M67 engines with Gnome-Rhone propellers. Both engine types had a takeoff power of 690 horsepower and produced 651 at 5,000 meters. 6311 carried 758 litres of fuel distributed between 2 tanks in the central part of the wing. I believe that an additional 188 litres of fuel could be carried in each wing route. The tanks were self-sealing. The crew consisted of a pilot, a radio operator gunner, and a navigator observer. For added resilience to damage, which was inevitable given the mission type, the observer had a second control setup consisting of rudder pedals, a removable column, a throttle handle, and an ignition switch. His instruments were, however, limited to a compass, airspeed indicator, and an altimeter. There were no instruments for the engines or controls for the landing gear or flaps. The assumption was that the navigator observer would just fly the aircraft to a belly landing in friendly territory in the event of the pilot being wounded or killed. For daytime reconnaissance, a fixed F-20 camera and a rotating F-30 were installed. For night reconnaissance, 2 large parachute flares were carried under the fuselage. When marking targets at night, 8 phosphorus-tipped marker rockets were also carried on 2 Alcan racks. For daytime bombing and close support, the F-30 camera was removed. In general, although the 6311 was intended for observation, it was heavily armed. Two Mach 1934 7.5mm machine guns were mounted in under-fuselage fairings, one of them fired forward and the other backwards. Each machine gun had a 300-round drum magazine attached. The front gun was aimed at the target by the pilot using the OPL-31M sight. The rear one was fired at a fixed angle of 5 degrees down. The radio-operated gunner had another identical machine gun on a Type 28 turret with 600 rounds of ammunition. Later examples of the type had increased forward armament to 3 forward-firing guns. There were also the 4 pylons under each wing, 2 or 4 50-kilogram bombs with the usual wing loading, plus 8 10-kilogram bombs in the bomb bay if the cameras were removed. An initial order for 3 prototypes of this 6311 quickly turned into 3 production contracts by the end of 1938 for a total of 415 aircraft. Ordering all of these aircraft across all of these types was one thing, but making them was much harder. Ramping up mass production of the engines, propellers, and cannons proved really challenging, particularly as many of the input metals and components were also required in other aircraft and rearmament-related projects. Having wanted 201 aircraft in service by January 1939, the Armée de l'Air had only 45 non-combat 630s and 27 631s. 74 airframes were sitting, fully completed in the factory, waiting for their engines, and a further 60 had engines but no propellers. Propellers proved a persistent problem for French industry to produce. Mass production wasn't actually achieved even by the time of the surrender. To get things moving, the nearly finished aircraft were fitted with whatever was lying around so they could be accepted for service. As propellers became available, these old units were removed and used to perform the same trick on other aircraft coming up the line. For similar supply-based reasons, 631s were often delivered with one 7.5mm machine gun and one 20mm cannon as forward-firing armament. The first batch of the aircraft simply had 4 machine guns and no cannons at all, vastly reducing their firepower. 60 630s and 88 631s were thus operational on April 1, 1939, of which 67 and 20 respectively were distributed in day fighter units, and the remainder were with night fighter squadrons. At least one day fighter squadron was wholly equipped with 18 631s, but the majority were in flights of 4 spread amongst the single-seaters. Despite the supply chain issues, the Potez 63 was relatively speaking an industrial success story. It was well thought out, and only 7,500 man-hours were required to make one, only slightly more than the latest Dewoitine D-520 fighter, and almost half as much as the outdated Morane-Saulnier MS-406. By January 1940, SNCAN factories were churning out 100 aircraft a month, and they maintained this pace until the surrender. Priority was being given to the 6311, and they were thus built in the largest numbers. In August 1939, the Armée de l'Air had 65 Model 630s, with 65 pressed into frontline service despite their reliability issues. They were distributed across 7 squadrons in France, with 10 machines assigned to Tunisia. 206 Potez 631s were also on charge, but only 117 were in frontline service. 11 squadrons in France had those aircraft, but only 2 of the night fighter and 1 of the day fighter squadrons had significant numbers. Single-engined fighter squadrons were supposed to have a flight of 6 Potez with them for direction purposes, but most didn't have the full complement. 4 aircraft were also assigned to Djibouti to boost the garrison there. 22 of the cancelled 633 model aircraft were on charge, but they were in reserve. They'd been retained from Chinese and Romanian orders for the type due to the emergency. They were intended for pilot training, but in December they were formed into a volunteer squadron intended to help the Finns against the Russians. That unit got as far as Tangmere before an armistice was signed that ended that conflict. Finally, there were 61 Model 637s on charge, of which 53 were operational in 2 large squadrons. Modernisation of the Armée de l'Air's observation capabilities was probably the most critical problem the service was trying to solve after that of fielding enough modern single-engine day fighters. A Dewoitine aircraft called the D-720 had been supposed to have been fielded by this point to replace 340 obsolete observation machines, but the first production example wasn't available. New contracts were therefore hastily arranged for as many as 860 Potez 6311s, intended to be operational by May 1940. In the end, the service would get 459 of these by the 14th of March, although they were a motley crew. 217 of them had Gnome-Rhone M6 engines and Gnome-Rhone propellers, as intended. 95 had the M4-M5 Gnome-Rhone with Levasseur propellers rather than Ratiers. The remaining 147 had M4-M5 engines and fixed-pitched wooden two-bladed Ratier propellers. They made the 6311 slower than the 637, and it was less manoeuvrable as well. Observers, however, liked the newer machine's smoother ride, but the lack of modern propellers was about to be a deadly problem. As the Army de l'Air mobilised, the 631 squadrons were moved up closer to the northeastern border so that they could patrol more easily. 8 aircraft were loaned to the Air Naval at Cherbourg, which was still using critically obsolete Douartin D376 fighters. 17 more aircraft followed them in the period through to April 1940. In early February, the weakness of the 631's forward battery of 1 machine gun and 1 cannon became very evident, and a program began to replace the machine gun with another 20mm and fit 4 under-wing machine guns for ground attack, but only 2 aircraft were actually upgraded by May 1940, though. The reconnaissance 637 had the most active service during the Phony War. The problems with the 63 design as a whole were evident in the skirmishes that their crews had with the Germans. The Potez 63 series were easy to fly and they were a stable, robust platform. The aircraft also turned quite well for a relatively large aircraft, but critically it was now both slow and it was lightly armed. From the first days of the war, Potezes were being shot down. On the 25th of September, an aircraft from Reconnaissance Group 52-2 was hit by flak on a mission, and then it was attacked by 6 Bf-109s, which shot it down, killing the crew of 3. On the 27th, another aircraft was shot down by 9 Bf-109s with similar fatal results. By the end of the 6-week campaign, 52-2 would lose 10 of its 14 aircraft, although many of the crewmen did actually survive. Even when escorts were available, the results were little better. On September the 30th, a formation of Bf-109Es bounced to 637 and its escorting Marine 406 fighters. The Potez was immediately shot down, as was one of the escorts. A lone Potez was shot down on October the 16th by 5 Bf-109s. If attacked, the Potez pilot's only option was to try and turn at low level and hope the Germans got bored. The Potez was tough and it proved capable of taking serious punishment to the fuselage and wings. Hit an engine, though, and things went quickly wrong. Casualties began to mount. A 637 was lost every 9 sorties. Minor irritations also added to the problems. At high altitudes, the controls, weapons, and cameras often froze because of the lack of a good heating system. Maintenance teams tried to make improvements to mitigate these problems, but they never managed to solve them fully. By the time of the German invasion, there were almost no 637s left in frontline squadrons. The 6311 that had replaced them was, unfortunately, not as much use as the French establishment had hoped. Due to a lack of spare parts, only 30% of them were ever available at one time. The 6311 therefore barely featured between September 1939 and May 1940. The 631 fighter directors were another early failure. Not only was it very difficult for them to use their radios to communicate with the fighters, the Germans quickly figured out that if they destroyed the twin-engine command plane, then they might destabilize the formation and improve their chances of making kills. Another portent of things to come was a tragic mistake on December the 21st, 1939. Returning from a mission, a 637 was attacked by RAF Hurricanes, who, mistaking it for a Bf-110, shot it down over the French troops below. The Potez's similarity to the heavy German fighter would prove deadly for its pilots, who faced their own anti-aircraft fire and fighter defences as well as those of the Germans. And then, on the 10th of May, Fall Gelb began with attacks on the squadron's airfields. 6311 units suffered quite badly in those early raids as their aircraft were more often than not immobile due to parts issues. Regardless, the 6311 was the most numerous Potez variant at the outset of the battle, so plenty of them remained. Those that did get into action promptly suffered heavy losses as they flew at low altitude trying to work out what the hell was going on in the chaos of the battle. Because there weren't enough Allied fighters to protect them, the observation aircraft were sitting ducks for fighters. By way of example, Observation Squadron 510 lost 6 aircraft on the ground due to strafing attacks, then a further 6 in just 25 operational sorties. They also operated from 14 airfields in 6 weeks because of the rapid retreat of the French army. Maintaining effective tempo of sorties was impossible in these circumstances. In another mission on the 17th of May, 24 Potez 631s assigned as night fighters to defend Paris were pressed into action against the oncoming German armoured column. 2 of these were confirmed shot down by flak, and 4 of the others failed to return to base for a 25% loss rate. Operating at low level was suicide for the large twin-engined aircraft. Emergency modifications were made in an attempt to increase firepower and suppress flak more effectively. These consisted of 2 additional machine guns under the fuselage in place of the flares, and 4 more under the wings. In an unusual example of French industrial effectiveness, these mounting kits were delivered just 12 days after the order for them was issued. The mobile rear-firing machine gun was also replaced with twin guns, and the fixed rear-firing machine gun was replaced by 3 belt-fed Mac 1934 M39 machine guns on an oscillating mount. That mount was pedal-activated, and it sprayed bullets over a 10-degree arc at a rate of 70 rounds a second. Despite the upgrades, attrition was very heavy. Exactly how heavy remains a subject for some conjecture. That's partly due to the fog of war, and partly because production and in-service numbers for the type are quite confusing due to the rate at which they reached fighting units, and the decision to relegate some aircraft to trainer status in short order. The total number of aircraft taken on charge by the Armée de l'Air consisted of 88 630s and 208 631 fighters for a total of 296 fighters, 37 633 attack aircraft, 61 637 observation planes, and 723 6311s. That gives a grand total of 1,115 aircraft of all types. Shortly after the armistice, a survey of remaining aircraft showed 197 630 and 631s, 18 633s, 12 637s, and 472 6311s. That means that 699 of the aircraft remained and 416 were unaccounted for. If we assume that all of those were combat or related operational losses, then the loss rate is 37%. The real loss rate is likely to be a bit lower due to paperwork issues and accounting for airframes removed from charge for other reasons, but even so, 37% is pretty severe. By type, the rate was about 32% in the fighters, many of which were lost when pressed into service as ground attack aircraft. It was 50% in the 633 attack aircraft, but the sample size of that is small. 80% in the 637 fleet sounds right given that those aircraft were savaged in the Phony War, as does 34% in the 6311 units. Sometimes the Potez 63 is targeted for criticism because of that high loss rate. It was a conceptually flawed aircraft. Twin-engined heavy fighters and attack aircraft were just not effective in Western Europe as a whole. It was also employed under unfavourable operational conditions and without fighter cover. Even the best aircraft in its class would have suffered heavy losses, and unfortunately the 6311, the most common of the series, was not the best of its kind. The critical issue was lack of power. The contemporary Bf-110C, that's commonly used as a point of comparison, was fully 50 miles an hour faster at 13,000 feet, and flat out it was 80 miles an hour faster. The Potez did turn better, but it was such a big target that it rarely stood much of a chance against the Bf-109 or equivalent Allied fighters that mistook it for a 110. That said, in large part, the Potez 63 was a rare success amongst the French aircraft of the 1930s. I say that because unusually it was suitable for mass production, and SNCAC were able to fulfill their promised production targets and the specification they were given. That seems like a minimum standard, but it's essentially unique. If similar promises on single-seat, single-engined fighter production had been met, then perhaps the Potez would have been more effective. But they weren't, and it wasn't. After the armistice, the Germans seized 134 Potez 63s of all types. Many of them were sent to Romania as trainers, so Romania, being one of the countries that had ordered the type for their own use, eventually got what they wanted. The Vichy Air Force retained large numbers as well, mainly in North Africa and Syria. On the 1st of November 1940, they could call on 22 630s that they used for training, 82 631s, 6 637s, and 236 6311s. By the time of the torch landings on the 8th of November 1942, those numbers had dwindled due to attrition and lack of parts to 6 330s, 64 631s, and 114 6311s. Many of those were simply destroyed on their airfields in the first days. 3 6311s were recaptured by the Free French and then used by them after 1944. They survived into the post-war period as trainers. Maybe that was appropriate. Although not an impressive aircraft dynamically, the Potez was a mass-produced industrial aircraft, an instrument of strategy. Its technical and conceptual failings were lessons that France needed to learn as it re entered the international stage, and perhaps in learning them, they set the French aviation industry up for the successes it enjoyed in the early, mid, and late Cold War.